What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over how we can use the player controllers to their fullest extent, meaning we will be able to have all of our actions and functions be called from the player controllers for both player 1 and 2, whether on controllers or on one input device, such as keyboard mode, like we have here. So one thing I can show you right away before even doing this episode, you can see that these values were printing the whole time. You can see that move right gets updated properly for each character. If I'm moving them both, they both have a value. Move controller is also being called. It's a little laggy right now because of all the logging. That actually does take a lot out of the game. So again, a little laggy, but once you remove the logs, it won't be so laggy. But you can see that I can do everything between player 1 and player 2 that I would normally be able to do, except it's all on the controllers now and not the character. There is some logic still in the character that we'll be showing off today, but all of our actual inputs are here for the controller. And now if I take a look at this, I pressed pause at the start, and you can see that I have this log perform start input logic that is called from the player controller. And that is going to be really useful for the next episode when we go over skipping the stage entrances and the character entrances. If we do this through the controller and not the character, we can even perform logic such as skipping these intros without the characters being spawned. We don't need any control over the character to be able to do that. Alright, so just for sake of showing you, going to load up the game. It's that FPS, and you can see the FPS is 60. Now that the logs are not printing every frame. I didn't want to show that drop in FPS and not show that it is due to the logs. I understand why that could be a bit scary. I'll even play on the actual stage that we were playing on to show you. And there you go. So it's maintaining a proper 60 frames per second. That jump is very normal. If you look at stat FPS, you can see what your game is running at. And you will be able to see that's jumping between like 59 and a little over 60 because it's trying to cap it at that value. So that's without the logs in there. You can see the FPS is much higher. Alright, so we're going to get started today. I believe this is episode 124 of the Fighting Game Tutorial series. We have done many episodes so far, and we still have many to go. But if you'd like to catch up and check out the entire playlist to see everything we've done to this point, I'll link this icon in the top right corner. Shows you every episode we've done in the Fighting Game Tutorial, as well as some other episodes that allow you to clean up your code, package your game, that sort of thing. Alternatively, I'll link you to this episode right here, which is the previous episode. This is where you can see where we started setting up the player controllers. Today we're finalizing them. So you want to check that out before you watch this one. Anyway, let's get started. So we go into our code today, and we can take a look at our base PlayerController.cpp and base PlayerController.h. We made this a while ago, and we officially set it up in the previous episode. Now I'm going to show you everything I have in here. It's probably what you'd expect, at least coming from last episode, but I'm still going to go over it so you guys can see everything I've done. So I have made a function for every input action that I'm listening for in the characters setup player input component function. So I have some logic in here that I haven't commented out, but everything you see commented out is a bind axis or a bind action. Now, we'll get into this in a little bit, and I'll show you commenting these out and which ones we want to keep and why we want certain logic in here. But thinking of it from this standpoint, you can see that I've commented out all the actions, and that's because we want all these actions and axes in our base PlayerController.h instead. So in the player controller, I do have this call in front of the function name, just so that I'm proving it's coming from the controller, not from the character. We're calling that function on the character from the controller. So in the previous episode, we had call move right, which worked for keyboard, and we had call jump. So we had one axis, one action mapping, and they both worked for player 1 and player 2. Now I want to move everything over, all my actions and axes. That way, whenever we are swapping characters for tag matches, or when we're doing things like pressing the start button to skip stage intros, then you'll be able to do it without the character being physically spawn because the controller is already physically spawned. So I have move right controller. Now remember, move right controller in the character class has some different logic than the keyboard one. And it gets blocked if we don't have a controller plugged in and if we haven't manually chosen that we want to use the controller logic. However, this will work for player 1 and 2. So I'm still adding this here today. You can use it and it will work after this episode, work with controllers. So we have call move right controller, call jump we already had, and then here are all the ones I'm adding. So call stop jumping, call start crouching, call stop crouching, call start manually blocking, call stop manually blocking, call start attack 1, call release attack 1, call start attack 2, call release attack 2, call start attack 3, call release attack 3, call start attack 4, call release attack 4. And then I have the start exceptional attack, which is kind of an outdated function. We are going to be updating the exceptional attacks and the meter burn attacks very soon when we get into our next episode of Combat Flow. But I'm leaving this function in here for now because we'll be able to repurpose it and use it properly very soon. And then I have call perform start input logic, which you may not have seen before. I did have it in the last episode, and a few episodes ago you could see it in the setup player input component, but I never fully explained what it was for. So let's go over that right now. We have this in our edit project settings input. We have this action mapping called open pause menu, and I bound it to the P key. Should also be bound to a button on the controller, probably like start, but I did not actually do that. And so what happens is this opens the pause menu, and it comes from the character. If we actually look at our character, I can go to the find results and look for open pause menu. So you have this logic here. So we were doing this in the character blueprint before, but now we can do it on the player controller, which allows us to do things like pause the game. Again, press the start button at times when the character is not spawned. We can skip stage intros. We can potentially separate the logic from pausing the game online when we get into that sort of thing. It'll be able to do the recommended logic for one character pausing it, other than trying to pause the entire game in a multiplayer session. So we have this open pause menu here. You can leave this for now. This is something we came up with many episodes ago. But I just want to show you that we are now going to be handling that in the code. So if we go to our fighter template character.cpp, so we go to our fighter template character.cpp and take a look down here. We had this logic in here that you may never have added. I'm just showing you that now. We don't need it in the character, but this is where I had put it for when I was going through the stage entrance skipping logic, but we're going to put it in the controller instead. Okay, so we can go to our base player controller. You can see we have all the functions here, including this new one. The possess pawn was set up in the previous episode. And now the base player controller.cpp has the same logic in the begin play and the constructor. We need to make sure we uncomment all these lines that we had and set up the proper logic in the setup input component. So we had this in the previous episode, which is still good. You can remove this else entirely if you'd like, because we don't actually need it with the way we use our keyboard mode hack. And then you need your axis. You need all your functions for your axes and your action mappings. And these have to line up exactly with what they did in the fighter template character. So this is the action mapping or axis mapping name. This is the function it's calling. Instead of calling the fighter template character functions, we're going to be calling the base player controller functions. Once you set up all these, you have to go and make all the functions. So I've set them all up the same way, where literally I had a log that was printing so I could test it, and then I just called the corresponding function on the character. So this one we did in the previous episode, but call move right controller, you can see calls move right controller on the pawn. So the fighter template character's move right controller function. Call jump calls jump, we set up before, and now here is just the gauntlet of all of these. So we have stop jumping, start crouching, stop crouching, start manually blocking, stop manually blocking, start attack 1, release attack 1, start attack 2, release attack 2, start attack 3, release attack 3, start attack 4, release attack 4, start exceptional attack, and then perform start input logic. The tick is also the same. Now, once I've done this, the player controller will bind to these and it will call these functions. Once you do that, you're going to need to comment out the bindings in the character or get rid of them. You could literally get rid of all these if you wanted. So we can get rid of them and clean it up. You can say I do have some logic in here that is actually still valid. So you don't want to do anything on the controller that can be bound to a specific character. In this case, these things could be bound to the controller, so you could move them over. But just to prove a concept here, we can still do logic in the character class in this function that can still set things up, and it doesn't have to be on the controller. So I still have this logic here, where I'm casting the game mode, and then I'm determining if this is player 1 or player 2 that is binding these actions, which will still be valid. I'll show you an example of this toward the end. And then we have the notify player locked in, which is when we allow the maps to be created and to be set up for the input buffer and command list. So I still have those in the fighter template character setup player input component. Now with that done, you may have noticed that you aren't able to call some of your functions in your base player controller. This is probably because they're not public. So the base player controller can't access protected or private functions of the character class. So the way you can do this, the simplest way, is just to put public at the start here. So above your start attacks, release attacks, all this stuff, you can say I put public, which allows these to be called by other classes. There are some other ones in here, like there's another public here, which is no longer needed. And then here's protected, where some of these functions can only be called from this class and children of this class. And you can organize it a lot better than I did. I just basically said, yep, I want to potentially call these functions, so I'm making them public. Feel free to actually go through and do the proper thing to make the ones public that you want, protected that you want, or private that you want. But regardless, just make sure you have public here. That way you can call the functions. You can always change it later. We probably will in one of our update episodes that we do. Once you get this building, you're in a pretty good spot. What you need to do is go into your base character blueprint. So you'll see that I haven't changed over all my player 2 keyboard mode hack logic to this new system yet. So in the previous episode, we set up jump P2 using this controller method. And you see I haven't done that for things like attack 1 P2. So why does this still work? This is because it's still calling the function for the character on player 2, so it will still work. The problem is it's not using the controller, so when we get down the line into those tag matches and into pausing or skipping for player 2, it's not going to work. So I'd recommend changing over all your logic to basically be this new method. So I'm going to actually get rid of this logic here, this old logic that we took out in the last episode. I'm going to just flat out take this logic out too. So for all these places, we're going to do the same thing. It's going to be a little repetitive, but we're just going to call the proper function. This is for the stop jumping function. So we want to call stop jumping. But you can literally copy this logic and then replace it everywhere. So we have this right here. Okay. Where we have attack 1 and release attack 1. So we can paste this in here and call the proper function, call start attack 1 on this base player controller. So it's not specifically calling these keyboard mode functions anymore, you'll notice. It's calling just the function off of the controller, which means we can actually get rid of the hacky keyboard mode functions. Again, making things cleaner. So you can do this for everything. Don't have to show you all of it because I'm sure you get the idea. But call release attack 1. So you're going to go down the list and you're going to do this for every single action and axis mapping that you have. You don't have to do it for move right controller. As you can see, we never set up move right controller in the blueprint. That is because the controllers are independent devices. They don't need a keyboard mode hack fix. So we never actually did that. All right. So yes, like I said, go through and just set up this logic for all of these. going to start copying doubles like this. Okay, here we're on move right P2, which we did this in the prior episode, but I never deleted the logic. You can now get rid of the old logic and move this up here. And there we go. So now all of our input actions use the controller as opposed to the hacky keyboard functions. And now you'll see, I don't have the logs in there, but you should see that everything is still working as intended. Also, I'm going to go into practice mode so I can show you something. So the isPlayer1 booleans that we set up in the character setup player input component, right here, true and false, that I was saying, they're still valid even though we're doing everything else in the controller. So they determine what input stack inputs go to, the icons. So you can see player 1 and player 2 are still set up and working correctly as they do display on the right side. You can see both controllers work well, player 1 and player 2 for keyboard mode, and again they will work for the actual controllers as well. Controllers are actually easier than the hacky 2 players on one input device. Now what we can even do at this point is we can actually go in and get rid of the P2 functions, P2 keyboard move right, P2 stop jumping, all these functions, because we're not calling them anymore, we're calling them from the controller. Okay, so all these I am getting rid of. So I don't need them anymore. I don't need that hacky logic. Just to prove it that we're good. I'm going to save, I'm going to launch again, and we're going to test one final time with our old hacky logic removed, and we'll have slightly better logic. Now we have to make sure we remove these functions from the CPP file as well. I actually completely forgot. So let's make sure we get rid of them here as well. And we have cleaned up this code class quite a bit. Alright, to make sure we've done everything correctly, once the editor is open, we should go into our base character blueprint. That is the only place where we are calling those P2 functions. It compiles fine, and we are good to go. At this point, everything should be working using the player controller and not the character for inputs, the majority of inputs, or a lot of the different actions and logic within that setup input player component function. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for the channel and myself than anything you can do, and I really appreciate it. Very grateful. And I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys so much. Very, very excited to get these episodes out to you every week, and I'm really grateful for the support that you've given me. I hope you continue to enjoy them. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. Be happy to help you out and assist you with anything you need. And anyway, guys, that's it. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.